Hello, this is Kathy Lewis. Welcome to this Concur Delegate webinar. In this webinar, we will look at some of the most frequent questions that come into our help desk and provide some answers for you. So what we're going to specifically look at is how you can tell when you're working in an expense report if you're logged in as yourself or if you're in as a delegate, and what do you do if you've started an expense report and you're not in the system as the correct person. We'll look at itinerary errors and what you can do to avoid getting those errors, either when you're creating or submitting an expense report. We'll look at the different meal options, actual meal costs applied to per diem versus actual meal costs in lieu of per diem, and also fixed meal allowance. We'll look at how to enter lodging expenses. You probably have gone through the training or may have used the feature for entering lodging, and you know that it does need to be itemized. Sometimes that can be a little difficult to do, so we'll look at some alternative ways to enter lodging. We'll look at some quick and simple ways to enter group business meals, particularly if they are greater than 10 attendees. We'll revisit the mileage feature, and specifically we'll review when do you have to deduct the home to office commute. We'll look at splitting allocations. Paying students will be covered in a separate webinar. We'll look at the process for requesting travel advances, and then we'll also talk a little bit about how can you check on the status of an expense report. So I'm going to go into the Concur system, and I'm logged in at this point as myself, and I'm on the expenses homepage. Now, if I go back to the Concur homepage, this is one place where you'll be able to double check if you are logged in as yourself or might be in as a delegate for someone. So obviously I can see my name here. If I need to delegate in as someone else, remember that you're going to do that under your profile setting. So if I go under profile and acting as another user, and I'm going to go in as a delegate for Heather. Keep in mind that when you are in as a delegate and you're viewing expenses or open reports, you're only seeing the information for that particular person. I'm only seeing Heather's expenses. I cannot copy these expenses to another person's dashboard, and I cannot copy someone else's to Heather's. If I open up a report, if I'm working as a delegate for another person and I go to submit the report, I am not going to have the submit button. Notice I also see that I'm acting as Heather, so when I am ready to submit Heather's report, my button is going to say notify employee. So it always goes to the employee first for their review before it forwards on to an approver. If I'm done working as a delegate and I'm back in as myself and I open up one of my own expense reports, notice I don't see any notation that I'm acting as someone else, and my button says submit report. So when you are entering expense reports for yourself, you do have the ability to submit directly to your approver. If by chance you create a report under your own name and it was really for someone else, it was their expenses should have been entered under them, unfortunately there's no way that you can copy expense reports from one person to another. So the only thing that you can do is delete the report, go in as that person, and recreate it. If the expense report has been entered incorrectly under the wrong person, it has already gone through the approval process, been approved and paid on, and the wrong person got paid, in that case, that person's going to have to submit a check to payment processing to reimburse the university for that incorrect payment. Payment is made to the University of Pittsburgh and sent to payment processing, and you would want to include some kind of documentation with that referring to the expense report number that it is pertaining to. I'm just going to go in as another person now that I have a little more information seated for. And I'm logged in as a test user. And I'm going to bring up one of the expense reports I've already begun. And this was for a trip to Boston. So I already have my header completed. Now, let's say in this case, you want to claim per diem for meals. But as you probably are aware, when you move from the header to this page, it will automatically ask you, excuse me, if you want to claim a per diem. And let's say initially you said no, but then at a later time you realize you do want to claim a per diem. You can still claim it at this point. You're going to go under Details, and you're going to go to New Itinerary. Remember that the per diem feature is based off of itineraries. Now, an itinerary is really no more than where did you travel to and what were your dates of travel. One mistake that people make is that when they use the itinerary feature, they are creating one stop. But at a minimum, you should have, for any itinerary, 2 itinerary stops. So the first stop is where did you leave from and where did you go to. So typically you're leaving from Pittsburgh, going to your destination city. So let's say we traveled from Pittsburgh on May 8th. We left Pittsburgh at 10 a.m. and we arrived in Boston a few hours later. Now, this date is going to be the same date. This is another typical mistake. People will put the return date in here, but this is just the first leg of the trip. Departed from Pittsburgh, arrived in Boston. On the same date, at what time? Left at 10, we'll say we arrived at 12 noon. So that is your first itinerary stop. Your second stop is going to be your return trip. When did you leave Boston and when did you arrive back at Pittsburgh? So we left on the 11th at 3 p.m., arrived back in Pittsburgh on the same date at 5 p.m. If you have layovers, maybe I couldn't get a direct flight from Pittsburgh to Boston, there was a layover in Cleveland, you do not have to include layovers in your itinerary, just your beginning and final destination. Here's my 2 stops. I'm just going to click on Next and click on my itinerary and click Next. Now you can use the per diem feature. So it has my dates of travel, my location, breakfast, lunch, and dinner, and it shows me the daily per diem. Remember that you're checking off meals that the traveler does not need reimbursed for. So the first day of travel, I didn't leave till 10 a.m., so I had breakfast at home. I do not need reimbursed for it. My last day of travel, I arrived home by 6 p.m. I do not need reimbursed for dinner. You're going to check that off. remember that the standard 75% reduction that you might have used in internet expenses for first and last day of travel, you do not use that 75% reduction in this system. What you're doing, again, is just checking off meals that the person does not need reimbursed for. Maybe lunch was provided by the conference sponsor. You can check off those dates. Notice how it automatically updates the daily allowance. If you need to exclude an entire day, you can just check off the box at the beginning of that date under Exclude All. Click on Create Expenses, and it will list your daily per diem allotment. It lists them from last day to first day of travel. If you want to rearrange that date, just click next to the date link. Now, I am going to view credit card expenses. Let's say I do have a couple credit card charges that are applicable to this trip. So I'm going to go to Import Expenses. And let's say that most of my meals I paid for out of pocket. But I did put one meal on the travel card, and I want to pull that into the expense report. So I'm going to select it and just use Move to the current report. I can see that this is a travel card charge. Now, in order that I'm not double dipping, I need to account for this and pull it off of the per diem. So being that I didn't deduct dinner for this day when I was checking off meals, what I should do is mark this as actual meal applied to the per diem. Actual meal costs applied to per diem. And when I select this, it will deduct this meal cost off of my per diem reimbursement. Notice the requested amount is 0 because I'm not getting reimbursed for this because it went on a travel card. And then when I mark it as applied to per diem, if I haven't accounted for it in my per diem screen by checking off dinner, again, applying it to the per diem reduces my reimbursable amount by this dollar amount of the meal. And I'm going to save that. Another meal option, another expense type that you can use for claiming meal cost is actual meal cost in lieu of per diem. So this would be used, let's say maybe you just took a one-day trip to a regional campus. There was only one out-of-pocket meal cost. You're not going to claim it per diem, but just reimbursement for that one meal. That would be actual meal cost in lieu of per diem. And you would just enter the actual meal cost and the vendor name. Again, just make sure you pay attention to fields that are marked with red because those are your required fields. Another meal type would be fixed meal allowance. So fixed meal allowance would be used when you're traveling, and let's say you are not going to claim per diem, and there's just a standard allotment that you can be given per day to cover meals. Maybe that's all your budget allows. So you can do something like, I'm going to be traveling for 4 days, and I'm allotted $30 a day. I can spend whatever amount, but this is all that my department can cover. And you can put something in like a daily meal allowance. And then just save. So multiple ways to handle meal costs. Now, with lodging, if we claim lodging, Notice that you are putting in a vendor, and you are entering your total lodging amount. But notice it doesn't allow you to save yet. And the reason why is because the lodging expense type requires itemization. So with itemization, what you have to do is put in your daily charges. You put in the number of nights that you're staying, and then a daily room rate, daily taxes, and then other daily charges. Now, some people have said that itemizing daily charges can be difficult, especially if there might be deposits that have already been paid, or maybe room rates can vary from one day to the next. Maybe you stayed on a weekend day, and then you've also stayed on during the week, and the room rates vary from the weekend to the weekdays. And how do you put a daily room rate in when it varies? So we do ask that you, as possible, use the lodging expense type and enter your itemizations. But if it's truly just a little too difficult because of those different reasons, maybe your traveler has booked multiple rooms for multiple people, such as students or guests, and it's just getting a little too complex, we do suggest that you use an alternative. And the alternative to the lodging expense type is just lodging deposit payments. And with this expense type, we again put in a vendor. And you could put in the total dollar amount, and you can save. This expense type does not require itemization. So I can save it, and then I want to make sure that I attach a receipt. So the actual daily rates are printed on lodging folios. So as long as you attach that, your approver will be able to get the daily rates and the taxes, etc. Okay, let's take a look at group business meals when they're larger than just a few people. What are some quick and easy ways to handle the larger group business meals? So let's say that on this trip you hosted a reception. And let's say there were 40 people in attendance. And typically with group business meals, the system is going to ask you to list the attendees. Now, if it's larger than 10 people, instead of listing attendees by adding new names, you can attach a group of people by attaching a setup group of people. And I'll show you how you can set up those groups ahead of time. You can also just name the event and then attach a sign-in sheet. So I'm going to go under attendees, I'm going to go to advanced search. An attendee type, I'm going to choose that this was a group event with more than 10 people. So instead of listing individual names, I'm just going to put in the event name. So this was some type of reception for new investigators. And I'm going to save that. So now it adds that event name under attendee name. And instead of listing all those people, I can just list the number of people who attended. I can see, after I save this, I'll see a breakdown of my cost. I can also include the number of people who were no-shows and see a breakdown of costs for the no-shows. And then I can save that, and I could attach, say, a sign-in sheet. Now, another way that I can handle these large events is by setting up groups ahead of time. So I'm going to save this for a moment. And if I go under Profile and Profile Settings and Favorite Attendees, let's say that maybe this new investigator group meets periodically throughout the year. Maybe you have meetings and they attend meetings 3 or 4 times a year, and you want to save names into a group and just attach the group name. So I can go under attendee groups, and I'm going to add a new group. So all I need to do is give this group a name. And then I would select the people who I want to be part of this group. Now, if their names do not appear here, I'm going to use the attendee feature to set them up. And it's just new, and then you put their first and last name in. But once I name it, select the people that I want to be part of this group, and then I'm going to save the group. And I can create multiple groups. Maybe they're student groups, alumni groups, whatever makes sense. Now, if I go back to my expense report, and I'm going to open up my report. And I am going to go to my group business meal. And it doesn't appear that that got saved, so I'll just create a new one now with my group. So I'm going to choose group business meal, greater than 10, or maybe it's a reception. Or here it is here. All right, I'm just going to open it up. So I'm going to remove my event name and add a group. So if I want to add a group that's already been set up, I just go to Favorites and Attendee Groups and select my group. Here they are, and I'm going to add it to my expense. And now those names have quickly been added to my expense. So either way are quick ways to handle those larger group events. Let's say I also want to claim mileage for using my personal car. I traveled from home to the airport before I took this trip, and I want to claim that mileage. So I'm just going to go under New Expense and Mileage Personal Car. And I'm going to put my waypoints in, my starting destination and my endpoint. And I'm going to claim this round trip. And here's my total mileage. Now, keep in mind that if I normally drive to work and I took this trip on normal business days, I should be deducting my normal home to work commute. So if I click on deduct commute, and I've done this before, so it does remember my starting point and my office location, and I'm going to deduct this round trip because both days of travel were on normal work days. If I traveled, say, on a Saturday or Sunday or holiday, or maybe I don't normally drive to work, I take the bus or I'm in a van pool, something like that, then I do not have to deduct my normal commute, but otherwise I should. So now this is being looked at, that normal commute is being looked at as personal mileage. Keep in mind that if I lived out, say, in Moon Township, and my commute to the airport round trip was only 5 miles, but when I'm not traveling, I'm traveling into Oakland, my normal commute is going to be greater than my commute to the airport, so I'm not going to get any reimbursement for that trip to the airport. I can just go back to the mileage calculator just by clicking here. If you want to split allocations, first you want to get all of your charges, all of your expenses into the expense report. Make sure none of these boxes are checked. And then you're going to go under Details and Allocations. And it will open up my allocation screen. I can select individual expenses, or I can select all of them just by clicking next to date, allocate the selected expenses. I can charge 100% to one account. I can put in different department numbers, purpose, project, etc. Remember that you are not going to see subcodes because subcodes are hard-coded to the expense types. If I need to add an additional account number, I just click on Add New Allocation, and I can allocate by either percentages or dollars, and I would put in the appropriate account numbers. If I'm charging to an account outside of my department, the system will allow me to put a different department number in here, but it will then change the workflow, so it will go to 2 approvers, the approver for my department and the approver for the other department that I enter here. So now there's multiple approvers, and both approvers would have to approve before this would go to payment processing. If you want to remove an allocation, just select it and delete it. And now 100% is back on my default account. Once I use this allocation feature, I will see an allocate icon next to my expense types, and if I hover over it, it will show me the account that that expense is charged to. when I'm ready to submit my report, I would just click on Submit. Now I'm going to go back to my Concur just to refresh my screen and expenses. I'm going to bring up another expense report. This is one that was returned by my approver. And notice that there's a group business meal here. And if you see an icon that looks like a greater than sign, it means that this can be expanded to further detail. So if I click on that, I can see that actually there was a personal expense that was deducted from this group business meal. Personal expenses can be deducted from any expense type, whether it's a group business meal, lodging, any expense type. And all you have to do when you're entering the expense type is itemize. So if I open this up, I will have an itemization button. So what I did is I put in one expense for personal expense non-reimbursable. And let's say that this was alcohol, and my department does not reimburse for alcohol as part of meals. So I'm deducting the alcohol portion of the bill, personal expense non-reimbursable. It will deduct this amount from the reimbursable expenses. The other itemized part is for the meal portion. When you itemize, it must add up to the total expense. So $25 is alcohol, $58.54 is the meal part. So this is the good part, and this is my personal reimbursement. And again, you can do this with any expense type by itemizing, but just make sure that your itemization adds up to the total expense. If I hover over comments, you can see that I had entered a comment that this was for alcohol. I can see that this portion is the portion for the dinner. I can see my attendees, etc. So pretty simple to add those personal deductions. You could do the same for lodging. Let's say maybe someone rented a movie one evening and you want to pull that off. Just do it using the itemization feature. Another question that has come up is, how do I use a converter for foreign currencies? So if I go back to my expenses, I've started an expense report for a foreign trip. And let's say I have car service and it's in a foreign currency. So I'm using the expense type for car, taxi or car service. I put my city in, which is a foreign location. The system will automatically know by this location what the default currency is for that city. So let's say my receipt is 35 euros. I just enter that amount in. It will automatically display the conversion rate and do the conversion from that monetary unit to US dollars. So you do not have to go to a other site to do the conversion. And whether it's taxis, meals, lodging, it can do the conversion for any expense type for you. Okay, now the final two points I just want to bring to your attention is that there's a lot of information for you out on the travel and expense management site. One of the things that people have been asking about is, where can I find the subcode listings? So remember that I had mentioned that when you enter account numbers, you're not going to see subcodes. This Concur system does not display subcodes. They are hard-coded to the expense types. But if you want to see what like to keep it. And travel advances are the exception, not the rule. And the reason why is because most people are traveling with a travel card. So they could put their expenses on that credit card and wouldn't need an advance. But depending on the person's situation, depending on where they might be traveling to, and especially if they might be traveling to a remote location, especially for an extended period of time, they might have difficulty using credit cards in that location, a travel advance might be warranted. There's 2 steps that you need to take with requesting travel advances. The first thing you have to do is submit a request to the manager of payment processing to have your travel advance approved. To do that, you come to the travel website, you go under training and how to request a cash advance. You could click on the link for customer service, and you're going to click on travel assistance. And use this travel assistance inquiry to complete this information for the traveler. Their first and last name, department email, etc., where they might be going to, and why they need a travel advance, what it would be for. And you want to submit that. And once it's submitted, it goes to the manager of payment processing. Once they approve this request, they will open up the travel advance feature for you within the Concur system. So if I go back to Concur, now once it's opened up in the system, you have to submit a travel advance using the request feature. So if I open up request, I already started a request for a travel advance. So what you're doing is filling out a request header. Just a trip name, where the person is traveling to, their dates of travel, etc. Now, under how are you booking travel, when you're requesting a travel advance, this field should always be option 3. Request for an Anthony Travel Agent Assisted Booking or other. You're completing this because you want an advance. Advances fall under other. So just remember in this field, it's always option 3. Then you're going to put in addition to an account number that the advance will get charged against, the advance amount that you're requesting, and just some comment that reflects what it's for. And then you go under expenses and then choose the appropriate expense type for the travel advance. A lot of times travel advances might be given for meal allowances or to cover airline fees, etc. So choose the appropriate expense type. And here we used a fixed meal allowance in this example. So you might be, maybe this traveler is, again, going to be in a remote location and they're not going to be able to use a credit card, so they're looking for an advance of $40 a day times 30 days of travel to cover their meal costs. And then you would save this and then submit it. And travel advances will always go to a department approver. Once they get department approval, they will go to payment processing. Once they're reviewed by the auditors, they will go for payment. Travel advances usually are initiated through a check, and payment processing will contact the person who is traveling when that check is available for pickup. Now remember that if you're acting as a delegate for the traveler, before you would put in this request, you want to make sure you're delegating in as that person. So the request is being entered by you, but for that traveler. So you want to make sure that you've gone in under profile and you've delegated in as the person who's actually going to be using that travel advance. Okay, we will be putting a separate webinar out on the website for paying students. So look for that one if that will be applicable to you, your work in your department. So thank you for watching this webinar. I hope that it has been helpful.